I am not a mental health professional. This video isn't intended to be serious medical advice or education. When people look back on King of the Hill today, they seem to agree that it was a good show, but it was slow-paced, overly down-to-earth, and often boring. It's also known for portraying a more conservative perspective than most shows, specifically a 2000s conservative perspective. I feel that this leads most people to believe that the show must have aged very poorly. I recently started watching it again out of nostalgia, and I fully expected it to be some dull curiosity of the past. But the more that I watched it, the more that I realized that the show aged actually very well. Like, surprisingly well. King of the Hill is actually one of the most unique cartoons ever made. Some of its reputation is definitely earned.
If you want out, get out now. As for the rest of us, we will be disrupting a Chuck Mangione concert. With kazoos.
Why kazoos, Hank?
Because they're portable, they're annoying, and Megalomart has them for $3 a case.
As far as the realism goes, you're not going to get a Western cartoon closer to reality than King of the Hill. All of the characters, while they're still very exaggerated, are people you could actually meet somewhere. The setting is a mundane town in Texas, and all of the plots, even the most far-fetched of them all, can happen somewhere in the real world. If that doesn't make it sound like the most boring cartoon in the world, it would at the very least make you ask the question, why is this even animated? Why not just call up live-action Hank Hill and get the ball rolling? The answer to that is complicated. King of the Hill doesn't deal in the impossible like most cartoons do. King of the Hill delves into the implausible, which is where its genius lies. It's reality, but it's also one step beyond reality. This idea boils down to even some aspects of its premise. Dale Gribble, one of the fan-favorite characters, believes in every conspiracy theory under the sun. However, it never even pops into his mind that his wife Nancy had an affair with John Redcorn, and that his son isn't actually his son. This gives King of the Hill a really unique niche, and a very special power that no other cartoon in history has had. These people aren't real, but in another sense, they kinda sorta are. In that sense, we get to see real people in exaggerated scenarios. We get to see quote-unquote real people dealing with an elderly woman trying to die in their house. We get to see real people survive a plane crash with a parachute not deploying. So many King of the Hill episodes work exclusively because the show was animated. If they were live action, then the characters accidentally buying crack cocaine under the guise of it being fishing bait might push suspension of disbelief too much for some audiences. This makes King of the Hill one of those shows where you can continually pull the yeah, that actually happened examples again and again and again. King of the Hill is down-to-earth characters in abnormal situations at its core, and that can give it a special power when both of these things come together. It's usually great for comedy, but it also has a sense of heart and a catharsis that no other show is capable of. This is where the two-parters come into play, and I want to talk about three of them, because they're where King of the Hill is at its strongest. Each of these three managed to resonate with me in very beautiful ways. The first two-parter of the series functions as both the Season 2 finale and the Season 3 premiere. Propane Boom and Death of a Propane Salesman. This is one of the show's first big events, because Propane Man gets propane PTSD. Hank gets post-traumatic stress disorder. This couple of episodes, which I'll call the Propane Boom two-parter, relies heavily on its themes. It's about grief and trauma and learning to accept the realities of death, and it's one of the best damn episodes of anything that I've ever seen. Episode 1 is all set up, highly comedy-focused, so I'll only go over it briefly. Hank is going about his typical everyday affairs when he learns that his version of the Walmart is starting to sell propane and propane accessories. Needless to say, that makes Propane Man angry. Business falls and he loses his job, and he's eventually forced to join the Walmart, where he's forced to work under the stewardship of an idiot, Buckley. Buckley was either on something constantly, or was on something constantly during important times of development. He also happens to be the boyfriend of Luann, Peggy's niece, and he's a particularly bad boyfriend. Beyond generally being dismissive and stingy...
How much was it again?
$300.
All I have is $400. And that's going towards my new trampoline.
He gives a job that she wanted to Hank instead. Then he acts stuck up when Hank tries to give him advice. This is also a minor character flaw, but Buckley also nearly gets both Luann and Hank killed. The episode ends with Buckley poorly handling a propane tank, which causes a propane boom in the Megalomart, and he fucking dies. Like, fucking dies.
All they found left of him was his name tag.
We have some remains that we're analyzing.
I don't want to make it seem like part 1 is light or boring, because it's not. When the tension is low, it's all about comedy, especially Hank and Luann's rivalry with each other.
Because I took your car keys and I flushed them down the toilet.
My favorite part of this joke is how Luann doesn't realize that she didn't flush Hank's keys as he's driving away, and only comes to that conclusion when Peggy asks about her keys. The genius of part 1 lies in how it doesn't feel like a part 1. This feels like a typical episode of King of the Hill. Hank gets a new job for an episode due to hard times at Strickland Propane. It's been done before and after. It's even going on about how large megamarts end up bulldozing small-town businesses, which isn't a new message, but it's right up with King of the Hill's typical oeuvre. But as the episode comes to an end, we get this music cue. We did get some foreshadowing with Buckley poorly handling Propane earlier, but until we get this music cue, we don't expect anything to happen. Like, the episode could have ended here with only part 1, with Hank and his cohorts annoying Chuck Mangione so much he has this big spiel about how bad Walmart is. Instead, Hank goes inside to get an air horn, putting himself in the proximity of the explosion. Buckley mishandles a propane tank, and in the last moments of his life, Luann breaks up with him. And then part 1 ends with a boom. A big boom. One that demolishes half of the building. I only gave this episode a quick recap, but I do want to reiterate that it is a great setup, specifically because it's not a setup, or barely a setup rather. Tragedy tends to happen suddenly and unexpectedly, and it's the aftermath where the messier issues lie. The show goes from comedy to psychoanalysis. Both Luann and Hank nearly died in the explosion, and were both left with heavy trauma. Luann not only lost her hair in the explosion, but it happened immediately after she broke up with Buckley, who died. On the other hand, Hank also suffered a major betrayal. Propane, something that had dominated a major part of his life for more than 15 years, and that he held immense sentimental value for, not only killed someone else, but almost killed him as well. Throughout part 2, we see how these two deal with their trauma, or rather, how they don't. Hank Hill is the epitome of stoicism. He rarely lets out an outburst of emotion, besides anger, I guess.
I'm gonna kick your ass!
It's to the point where it's a special episode when he laughs, and it's a special episode when he cries. But one of the main cruxes of Hank Hill is that he tends to ignore his emotions as much as possible. And I love the nuance that King of the Hill applies to this. Nowadays, especially in media, stoicism and apathy are portrayed as a flaw more often than not. We get a lot of lessons about how important it is to never bottle up your emotions and just let them out. If a character in an episode is stoic, it's usually portrayed as a character flaw. It's really a pushback to the sentiment of the 80s and 90s where stoicism was celebrated to a fault. Because of this, it's easy to forget that stoicism is not a flaw in and of itself. It can actually be an important quality to have. A good example of this is in part 1 when Hank loses his job. This puts the family in a precarious position, since they've lost their main source of income, and it also must be rather hard on Hank himself, since a major piece of his identity was essentially robbed from him. But throughout the first episode, he does keep a cool head and does what he can to try and find a job, and the job that he does take ends up being just as degrading as being unemployed, but he swallows those feelings to keep the family afloat. If Hank was letting all of his emotions pour out then and there, it wouldn't help the situation. In many episodes of the show, things only start going wrong when Hank drops the stoicism and stops thinking rationally. Hillenium is a good example of that. However, there is a counterpoint within the show. You can't stuff down everything all the time. Emotions are something that you have to deal with. Not always as they come, but sooner or later. In part 2, Hank's mental state starts to degrade. He keeps up the same stoic front.
Well, that's the good thing about death. You either die or you don't.
But it's clear that he's shaken. The episode itself calls it a phobia propane, but within the context, it's a clear portrayal of post-traumatic stress disorder. Phobias are based entirely in fear, particularly irrational fear. Someone with the phobia will avoid the object of their phobia, often not even understanding why. Hank, meanwhile, has a specific trauma that ties into his fear of propane. And when Hank has to deal with propane, his behavior tends to be explosive. When he almost turns on the grill and when Peggy tries to relight the water heater, he experiences flashbacks and reacts in panic, terror, and anger. Propane Man doesn't want to deal with propane anymore. He doesn't want to grill for himself or others. He doesn't want to go back to his propane job. He also seems to be shaken in some sort of other ways too. Small ways. Like pouring beer into a glass instead of drinking it straight from the can like he usually does. Whatever the case though, Hank Hill has some significant death anxiety. Most people go much of their lives without thinking about death, and this is a good thing. It tends to be a mental trap. Thinking about one's own mortality is emotionally painful, and when it really does hit you that you are going to die, like for the first time, you can't logic your way out of it.
Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got it's like this, man, the dust in the wind, man.
There is literally no argument you can logically make that will make the concept of your death okay. It's a mental trap that I've been caught in before for years at a time. Because eventually something happens that forces you to really confront it. Either someone close to you passes on, or you have a near-death experience yourself. And it can become this gripping fear. It's one that, if you let it, can turn you into a shell of yourself. I love how this is portrayed in this episode. Like, to the point that this episode helped ease a lot of my own emotional pains. A lot of King of the Hill actually does that for me, surprisingly. At one point in the episode, Khan tells a Zen Buddhist parable called The Tigers and the Strawberry. I won't retell it word for word, but the message is important. No matter what you do, you will die. Even if you're on your deathbed after a long life of a million accomplishments and surrounded by friends and family, you still have to die afterwards. But focusing on that fact is folly. Obsessing on death is death in and of itself. So all you can really do is learn to live in the moment and appreciate what you have. Luann's plot is similar to Hank. While she doesn't seem to be concerned about death, she is still bottling her feelings. However, instead of suppressing them, she's taking up causes she doesn't really care about as distractions. She focuses on the pain and loss in the rest of the world in order to ignore her own situation. Luann's plot doesn't get as much attention as Hank's. It's mostly comic relief.
This is a picture of what a hungry Irish child looks like.
But it is an exaggerated depiction of the way that some people actually deal with grief and loss. Find a distraction. Any kind of distraction. It doesn't matter what it is. She ignores her feelings just as much as Hank does, despite doing it a lot louder. Death is one of the harshest realities that we face. Being born, destined to die. And whether we believe something happens after or we don't, it is a source of anxiety that we will have to deal with sooner or later. While King of the Hill's wild scenarios put these thoughts and feelings on the table, its down-to-earth nature helps make them so much more digestible. This particular episode has resonated with me far more than I'd actually like to admit. Speaking of death, next time on Admirable Animations, we will be learning how Hank Hill deals with anxiety when he gets accused of a murder.
In the murder of Debbie Grund.
Oh, that. Oh, God!